Um, Welcome everybody to today's lecture in our Deccan webinar series, from Malabar to Coromandel, which may be better titled from Konkan to Coromandel. We would like to say, that our thoughts are with everybody in India right now going through the pandemic. And we hope that today's lecture will uplift us with some beautiful buildings. My name is Vivek Gupta, and I'm one of the co-organizers of this series. And I would like to introduce Abhishek Mehta, who is a DHF, Deccan Heritage Foundation UK board member and the founder of Blue Lotus investment firm. Abhishek. Trying to spotlight you.
Yeah, he is.
But the microphone needs unmuting. Yeah.
He's here.
Great, thank you. I was just waiting for a host unmute. Apologies for that. Thank you so much, Vivek. At the outset, I too would like to express my best wishes for those around the world, and particularly in India during this pandemic, which continues to be an enormous challenge. Please stay safe and healthy. Today, it's a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Julia Hegewald. One cannot distill her wonderful work and accomplishments in a brief introduction, but I'll attempt to do so. Dr. Hegewald is professor and head of the Asian and Islamic Art History Department at the University of Bonn in Germany. For 12 years until 2014, she was the director of the Emmy Noether Research Project on Jainism in Karnataka. She has authored numerous books, including many on Jain history and culture. She is a definitive expert on Jainism. In fact, she's an expert in many areas: a BA in Nepali language and art, a master's from the Oriental Institute of the University of Oxford, and a PhD in the history of Indian architecture. It is inadequate to put into words how much research Dr. Hegewald has done and how many accolades she has received. And speaking with Dr. Hegewald, I learned of her 10-year adventure in writing her book on Jain temple architecture in India. This dedication is inspiring. Today, we are celebrating Dr. Hegewald's guidebook, The Jaina Tradition of the Deccan. Dr. Hegewald's lecture today is on Jain temple architecture of coastal Karnataka, which focuses on climatic dependencies and artistic freedoms. When Helen kindly asked me to introduce Dr. Hegewald today, I of course accepted with delight. But in learning about what Dr. Hegewald has done, it really hit me. Dr. Hegewald is German, and she's one of the world's leading Jain experts. Now, I am Jain, and growing up in a Jain family, I realized a lot of our traditions and rituals oftentimes had little context. Someone like Dr. Hegewald had a burning desire to understand another culture, and I think that's beautiful, especially during times like these when there's a tendency to sometimes think and act inwardly. We miss the broader perspective that is humanity. I thank Dr. Hegewald for sharing her passion, knowledge, and her love of Jainism. Dr. Hegewald, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so very much, Abhishek Mehta. Thank you, Abhishek, for these very, very kind words, much too kind. Thank you for introducing me, for supporting the publication and the Deccan Heritage Trust, which does such amazing work. I would, of course, also very much like to thank Helen Phelan and Vivek Gupta for inviting me to speak in the series and for organizing the lecture series, continuing even into the autumn and the winter, as I've just heard now. I would like to thank the Deccan Heritage Foundation, the Center of Islamic Studies in Cambridge. Of course, special thanks go to Her Royal Highness in Mysore and the Sri Shikantadatta Narasimha Bodhiya Foundation in Mysore, who have kindly supported this undertaking, this lecture series, and made it possible. Thank you to everybody. I feel very honored to be invited. I will switch on my PowerPoint to share my images with you. I hope that's visible to everybody. The paper presentation today, as we just heard, celebrates and launches the latest guidebook in the Deccan Heritage Foundation series, authored by me, and it focuses on the Deccan High Plateau and coastal Karnataka, the Jaina tradition of this region. I would not just like to present a summary of the book, but use examples of temple architecture discussed, of course, in much more detail in the publication. And I would like to use them to discuss the connection between climatic dependencies and artistic freedoms, which are particularly pronounced, I would argue, or very, very obvious in this region, the region of the Deccan Plateau and coastal Karnataka. So I've widened the scope a little bit. I'll include a little bit of material on the high plateau, the dry plateau of the Deccan Plateau, to contrast the two regions, which I think makes my argument even clearer. My interest in dependencies versus freedoms, which might at a first moment maybe seem a little bit odd, derives from an interdisciplinary and trans-regional research cluster at the University of Bonn, which has started in 2018, in which I'm involved as principal investigator. And this cluster examines slavery, but also extreme forms of dependency much more widely. So it's called the Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies, but my work is not on slavery, but on dependencies, which are very interesting to.
We lost you. We know.
Julia, I hate to interrupt you, but we cannot hear you.
Yes.
We cannot hear you.
Neil.
Neil, I think you need to unmute yourself. I'm sorry.
No, I'm asking Julia to unmute herself. She has to do it from her side.
I've done it. I think I've done it. Is that right?
Yeah,
Yes.
that's fine.
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
We are dependent on sound, so.
Yes, exactly. You find dependencies everywhere.
Yes.
Okay. So so my work there inquires into the limitations posed by dependencies, but also researches the freedoms which can still be found in situations of extreme dependency. Okay, let's move to India. In my paper today, I wish to discuss how architecture is strongly dependent on and has always been adapted to climatic conditions. The geography, but in many ways also the local climate, determines the availability of local construction materials. This dependency on climate and building resources will be contrasted with the freedoms and choices which are still available to architects, master builders, and artisans in their design process. I want to discuss questions of dependence and freedom by examining Jaina temple building traditions from the Deccan region, and I've chosen two closely related but widely differing areas. On the one hand, above the Deccan High Plateau, which is dry. This is a photograph from close to Shravanabelagola, and then the more humid, low-lying, wet Western Indian coastal belt, exemplified in this photograph below. I would like to start with a few words of introduction to Jainism and Jaina history in the region. As so far, this lecture series has tended to focus slightly more maybe on Hindu and Islamic traditions, although of course we have seen wonderful Jain temples already. Jainism finds its origins in eastern India and Bihar in the 5th, 6th century BCE, and according to legend, due to a severe drought and a resulting famine, the Jaina community moved away from the 3rd century BC onwards, migrated from the region, and along the way, at least according to legend, the community split into two sections. One part remained in the north, but migrated further into the west, and the second portion, allegedly led by the famous teacher, the Acharya Badra Bahu, went south into the Deccan. These southern migrants are believed to have created the Digambara form of Jainism, the space or sky-clad, which means really naked followers, the Digambaras, as opposed to the white or cotton-clad Shwetambaras, as you can see the gentleman on the left, which is more prominent in the north and west of the country. According to legend, Badra Bahu died a voluntary religious death by strictly supervised starvation known as Salekana in the Deccani pilgrimage center of Shravana-Belgola, probably in about 298 before the Common Era. Through inscriptional references, literary works, as well as sites and edifices allegedly visited by him, this story has been ingrained in the religious memory of the region. And on the left, for instance, we can see his so-called meditation cave, the place where, according to legend, he reached Kevanyana, full knowledge, full enlightenment. And we have these 2 feet, soles of the feet. They're not really foot imprints marking the actual spot. However, it is actually more likely that wandering or actually, I should also explain the photograph on the right. So Badra Bahu allegedly was accompanied by Chandragupta Maurya, the grandfather of Ashoka. And it's interesting that we have some narrative panels. Actually, these are 48 panels, and we have another set that date from the 12th century and are found in the Chandragupta Basadi on Chandragiri. And these narrative panels kind of narrate the story of Badra Bahu, the famous Jain teacher, accompanied by Chandragupta on their way to the south. Now, this is a legend, and this is very present at all places, and the story keeps on being repeated. Historians would probably say that it's actually more likely that wandering Jaina monks transmitted the religion over centuries from Bihar through Orissa into Tamil Nadu in the early centuries BCE, that that Jainism reached Tamil Nadu before the end of the 4th century BCE, and that Jainism spread from Tamil Nadu to Karnataka in the early centuries of the Common Era. We assume that it probably reached Karnataka in the 2nd century CE. Whereas Jainism was gradually losing influence in areas of northern India, other than Rajasthan and Gujarat, where they continued to play a really important role in the early centuries of the Common Era, it continued to flourish in the southern states, especially in Karnataka. And this appears to have been due to the patronage of a number of local rulers. From the mid of the 4th century, Jainism definitely experienced great support by the Western Gangas, the contemporary Kadambas, and the Western Chalukyas. And Shravana-Belgola developed into a prominent pilgrimage center, probably already in the 5th century. And on this left, you can see some early remnants of Jain inscriptions scraped into the natural surface of Chandragiri and Vidyagiri at Shravana-Belgola, and we have many of these foot representations marking spots of enlightenment by both Jain ascetics as well as also the laity. And while traces of Jaina structures and inscriptions dating from the 7th century have been preserved, the earliest statues and temple buildings date from the 8th to 10th centuries. And the image on the right is a good example because it shows the 3 shrines of the so-called Chandragupta Basadi, which dates from the middle of the 9th century. The rest of the temple was added later in the 10th and 12th centuries. The carving of the colossal statue of Gomateshvara, which you can see here at Shravana-Belgola by Chamundaraya, the famous general of Narasimha II and Rajamala IV in the 10th century, marks probably the zenith of Jainism and its influence in Karnataka and South India in the 10th century. It's a monolith, it's one single piece of stone, it's about 18 meters high, and it was probably consecrated in 981 CE. Large numbers of Jaina settlements and temples, and the Jain temples in the region are known as Basadis or Bastis, emerged in Karnataka at this time. The term Basadi or Basti derives from the Sanskrit word Vasati, meaning a residence of God. The situation started to change from about 1000 CE onwards, when the fortunes of Jainism started to wane also in southern India. From the middle of the 12th century, Jainism began to be threatened by Hindu groups such as the Vaishnavas and Sri Vaishnavas, so Bhaktas, by Virashaivas, and in the northern Deccan region also by Muslim migration into the area. At this time, many Jaina sacred edifices were destroyed or absorbed and transformed by incoming religions and their converts. So we have a lot of desecrated, beheaded Jain statues or images which were at least removed from their pedestals, preserved at many Jain sites. But it's interesting that Jain temples very often were actually reused. They were taken over and converted, which makes them which has preserved them and also shows very interestingly the differences between religions and between ritual use. In the south, the Jains only kept a backing in the modern state of Karnataka, where they continued to be important and influential, at least in a number of small places. And this is definitely the region around Sranabelgola on the Deccan High Plateau, as well as in the remoter coastal strip beyond the Western Ghats, the two areas which we'll be focusing on today in this presentation. And in these areas, Jainism still flourishes to the present day. So let's now examine the local geography and climate and the availability of building materials in these two regions. As pointed out at the start of the presentation, Karnataka at least falls into two distinct geographic and climatic zones. The first is shown in these images here. The modern state capital of Bangalore lies on the southern plateau, which is a relatively dry highland, illustrated in these photographs, and in those parts where irrigation is available, as down below here, for instance, one finds cultivations of ragi, which is a form of millet, paddy coconut trees, and areca palms. But otherwise, as is shown above, the region is a high desert with large stretches of really relatively barren terrain. To reach the coastal region of Karnataka, one has to descend a steep mountain ridge, the Sahyadri Hills, and at the bottom lies the Canara region, a long and narrow lowland which stretches for about 300 miles from north to south. The region is known as Canara, but also Dakshina Kannada, Tulunadu, Tuludesha. There's a variety of terms used. The region has its own local languages, Tulu and Konkani, and a unique culture which shows lots of borrowing between religious groups and cults. This narrow strip of relatively level land is watered by a number of streams and consequently very fertile, as you can see in the photograph down here, particularly when contrasted with the images which we just saw before. The Sahyadri Hills, ranging from 2,000 to more than 8,000 feet in height, present a strong barrier for the heavy monsoon clouds approaching via the sea. And this causes generous and regular rains to go down over the coastal belt. This has favored the growth of dense evergreen forests, consisting primarily of teak and sandalwood. Otherwise, these are accompanied by bamboo groves, cultivations of coffee, cashew nut, areca nut, tea, cardamom, coconut, banana, often in very large plantations. So it's an extremely fertile region. Jain temples are found throughout Karnataka, of course, on the Deccan uplands as well as in the coastal belt. And I would now like to examine the influence these distinct geographical and climatic situations have had on material resources and building traditions, because they directly influence the shape of the temple buildings, as you will see very clearly in the examples in a moment. If we return to the Deccan Plateau and start there, here temples are largely made of cut stone, and this can be a soft yellowish sandstone or a greenish gray harder granite, which others have been made of steatite. It's the same as soapstone or potstone, which is a form of chloritic or talcic schist. And here you can see two prominent examples from this region. On the left is the Chamundaraya Basadi on Chandragiri at Shravanabelogola. It was commissioned by Chamundaraya in about 982 and is a Ganga, an early Ganga temple, whilst the temple on the right, the Akana Basadi in Shravanabelogola town, dating from 1181, is a Hoysala style temple donated or commissioned by a female patron, Achala Devi, the wife of Balala II. The temples follow the typical features of the South Indian temple style, the Dravida style. And as part of this idiom, they have a relatively plain exterior walls. Some have been adorned with pilasters and niches, as you can see in both examples. And the temple's walls are crowned by a prominent roof molding, a capota molding, which is topped by a number of ornate elements. And these include pavilions, as you can see here, and horseshoe-shaped arches, creating a very elaborate parapet. And the same pattern is then repeated in the roof tower. And here the elaborate composite cornices have been employed in diminishing layers. You can see here on the left particularly well to create pyramidal roof shapes. And these, of course, signpost then the most sacred element of the temple, the image inside the shrine below. Here are two more examples. The one on the top shows that the niches can also be filled with decorative elements. Here, these rondelles in the Nagara Jinalaya Basadi, dating from 1195 in Shravanabelogola town. And much more rarely, but this is a beautiful example where you can see that there are also Jain temples following this typical Hoysala style of including very ornate figural representations. This is the Shantishvara Basadi in Jinnanathapura, dating from the late 12th century. But this is a style which is much more common with Hindu temples, and the Jain temple structures tend to prefer more planar, more basic facades, which are more reduced. Throughout the region, there are particularly many Jaina temples which consist of more than one shrine, and these can either be double temples, Dvikuta Chala arrangements, or more often three shrines arranged in the shape of a three-petaled clover leaf. This is probably the best known example following this layout. It's the so-called Odegal Basadi, a 12th century Hoysala temple on Vindhyagiri at Shravanabelogola. And you can see that it's built on a strong slope. Steep access stairs lead up to a porch. There's a joint mandapa, and then we have one shrine here, one at the back, and one exactly opposite. And whilst we just said before that pyramidal Dravida towers are most common in this region, this temple illustrates that there are also examples which have flat mandapa and flat shrine roofs. And it's interesting here that because on the dry Deccan Plateau, flat roofs pose no problem, we do not need to lead off masses of rainwater. So this is quite possible here. Now, we said that these three shrined arrangements in the shape of a three-petaled clover leaf are most common. Now, what you can do is you can add two more shrines at the front to create a five-shrined arrangement. These are then known as Panchakuta Chala temples. And there is a wonderful example at Kambathalli, not very far from Shravanabelogola. It's a large complex entered through a gateway. And then we have two facing shrines between which you pass further to the three-shrined arrangement behind, which is very difficult to photograph if you're not flying in a kite or can rise high up. But I think you can see three of the five shrines here quite well. This was commenced in the late 9th Ganga period by Ganga King Rajamala II, but extended further in the 10th and 11th centuries. Now I'll show you a little bit of the inside decorations. It is very common of Ganga, Hoysala and Chalukya temples to have elaborate ceiling decorations, the vitanas, and these can either be corbelled lantern ceilings, as you can see on the top. This is an example from the Akana Basti, 1181. They have usually then a lotus pendant projecting from the middle. However, particularly striking, I find, are these square flat ceiling arrangements, which are very common on the Deccan Plateau. They usually consist of 9 squares. This is the elaborate ceiling in the Shantinata Basadi at Kambathali, and it shows Shantinata surrounded by the 8 Ashtadikapalas, who are the 8 guardians of the directions of space. Okay, so much to the tradition, temple tradition on the dry Deccan Plateau, our first region. I would now like to turn with you to the wet lowlands of the coastal area. And you will see immediately in the first image, which I'll be showing you, that although we are only something like 20 or 40 kilometers in linear distance away from the high plateau, the architectural situation is a completely different one. So although the temples on the west coast of which this is an example, are also found in South India, they do not follow usually the general South Indian Dravida temple style. Due to the ready availability of wood in the coastal belt and the need to protect buildings against heavy monsoon rains, shrines throughout the region are characterized by having widely projecting sloping roofs. And of these, we can often have several superimposed on top of one another. And this makes them slightly reminiscent of pagoda temples in neighboring Kerala, but also in Nepal and even in the Far East. Now, when comparing these traditions, it's important to realize that the temples in coastal Karnataka, Kerala, and Nepal, which look or have pagoda roofs, are due to a shared very wet climatic condition. Kerala is not far from coastal Karnataka, so that's the same condition. And then Nepal is on the slopes of the Himalayas, where again we have heavy rains being discharged, so the clouds can rise over the Himalayan peaks. Now those temples in China, Korea, and Japan are so-called true pagoda temples, real pagoda temples, which follow an entirely different logic and have been derived from the Buddhist stupa. Now this temple here is at Karkal, and the steep slanting temple roofs of coastal Karnataka have traditionally been covered with terracotta tiles, as you can see in these images here. And the clay for firing is locally available. So we are looking from below into the roofs of the Pashvanata Basti at Venur and the Shantinata Basadi at Hiriangadi. And you can see the use of wood and terracotta tiles making up these roof constructions. Now, projecting wooden struts or brackets, often figuratively carved, support these widely overhanging roofs. This is part of the Chandranata Basadi or Hosa Basadi at Mudabidri, dating from the 15th century. These overhanging roofs are further supported by wooden pillars from below, as you can see here on the side very well in this temple from Padangadi. And the outer walls of the temples are usually plain and traditionally made of wood and mud, which of course creates a very comfortable climate inside the temples. Here you can see much more elaborately carved wooden pillars and ceiling constructions. These photographs have been taken in the Pashvanata Basadi at Venur. Here you can see that even when temples have substantially been renovated, obviously with this very posh, shiny stone in recent years, kind of stone cladding which has been applied to these wooden and mud-built temples, the roof or the wood, the roofs and the wooden elements have often been retained because they're so much part of the local tradition, and of course are also very impressive and beautifully carved. However, over time, and probably as a reaction to stone-built temples of the Deccan Plateau, stone was introduced for structural building also to the coastal region. It seems that first basements and also pillars, as you can see here, supporting the wooden roof, were carved in stone to obtain probably a longer durability and also to be able to carry heavier roof structures. Due to the scarcity of hard, durable stone in the region, however, it remained a rarer, more expensive building material used for sacred structures only. And this is the roof of the Kere Basadi at Karkal. In the following, however, also the widely projecting roofs, which are of course indispensable due to the wet climate, were translated into stone. Instead of light terracotta tiles, which we have seen so far, stone slabs here and here, usually made of a local laterite stone, were created. And through this, the roofs substantially gained in weight, as you can imagine. This is the Shantinata temple at Venur and the Chaturmukha temple at Karkal, of which I'll show you a better image now. This is again the Chaturmukha temple at Karkal, and this is the Chandranatha or Hosa Basadi at Mudabidri. Now, as a result of these very heavy stone constructions on the roofs, these roofs had to be supported on exceedingly large numbers of pillars below, as you can see in both examples. Here even we have double rows of pillars, whilst normally there's only one row. And due to its large number of pillars, for instance, this Chandranatha Basadi in Mudabidri is also known as the 1,000-pillared temple. I would now like to show you interior photographs of the inside of both temples to show you how the roofs are supported below by pillars and how they look from the inside. And you can see that there's an enormous similarity to the wooden constructions which we have seen before. Here, really, wooden construction techniques have one-to-one been translated into a different medium, into stone. And you can see that they're beautifully carved. So above is the Chandranatha Basadi in Mudabidri, and below the photographs come from Karkal. Both are, I mean, the Mudabidri temple dates from 1429 and the Karkal example from 1586. So they are sort of 15th, 16th century constructions. It is very common also of the structures in the coastal region to have elaborate decorated ceilings. So here we have quite a close connection to the Deccan High Plateau, but we don't, or very rarely have these flat ceilings. They're more likely to have these lotus pendants and to be made or constructed in a core-built technique. Here are examples from Karkal, Hiriangadi, and from Venur. Interesting in the coastal region is that many of the temples throughout this coastal belt are multi-storied and accommodate superimposed sanctums on either 2 here above or even on 3 superimposed levels, as at Mudabidri. Often for structural reasons, I would say the upper floor levels have been constructed in wood, as you can see here. I think it's visible on the photo. This is wooden slanting. Or it's a combination of stone and wood with the upper story completely made of wood. And then the roof here is often covered with copper sheeting, which is even lighter than the terracotta tiles and also more precious and expensive. And we have then images on these superimposed levels. For instance, here in Mudabidri, you have Chandranatha below. On the second story, we have 3 jinas, Suparshvanatha, Parshvanatha, and Mahavira. And in the very top shrine level, we have 24 jinas made of crystal. Or often it's a jina, as here, for instance, in the Guru Basadi, which takes its origins in the 8th century. We have a Parshvanatha below. And on the first floor, we have a cosmic representation, a so-called Nandishvara Dvipa presentation. It's a sculptural visualization of the 8th continent of the Jaina cosmos. However, there are also examples where the upper stories have also been constructed fully in stone, as you can see here in Hiriyangali, the Shantinata Basadi, and in the Badaga Basadi at Mudabidri, dating from the 15th, 16th century. So then there just needed to be stronger supporting constructions below. Now inside, access to these upper stories is provided by wooden staircases. They can be quite simple, as here in the Parshvanatha Basadi at Venur, or more formally constructed, as here in the Shantinata Basadi at Guruvayana Kere, where also visitors are allowed to proceed up and to view, in this instance again, a cosmological representation. Now, further local peculiarities are the positioning of offering altars and pillars, often in large numbers, at the front of the temples. All basadis which host a car festival, who have a rata, have a flag post at the front. And this is, for instance, here the case in the Badaga Basadi in Mudabidri and also in the Chandranatha Basadi in Mudabidri. They both host car festivals. And the pillars have axially been placed at the front of the temples, either outside the gateways or inside. This is inside the compound. So the positioning can vary a bit, and sometimes we even have a mana stampa and a flag post outside the gateway, and then offering platforms inside, which are again axially aligned, as here in the Sri Padmavati Amanavara Basadi in Hiriyangadi. Particularly typical of Jainism, of course, are the mana stampas, which are widespread throughout India, particularly in a Digambara, but at times also in a Shvetambara context. Mana stampas carry representations of 4 jinnas, either seated or standing, facing the 4 directions of space. This is an example from the Shantinata temple at Venur. But interesting is that in Karnataka, and with particularly many examples in the coastal belt, we have other pillars which are known as Brahmadeva stampas or Brahma stampas, which carry an image of Brahmadeva, who is a yaksha. A yaksha is a guardian deity or an associate of the jinna, but they're also kshetrapalas. They guard the temple compounds, and Brahmadeva can always be identified by carrying a club and a lemon. A club and a lemon. These are freestanding in Karkal, both from Karkal above and from Venur below, from the Gomateshvara statue enclosures. And the one on the right from Guruvayana Kere shows you that often very elaborate and beautifully formed raised pavilions were constructed around these pillars. So Brahmadeva can be seen here, it's a pillar, and this 4-legged pavilion was raised later to house this sacred yaksha or kshetrapala. Now, in addition to the kshetrapala on the Brahmadeva pillars, a small shrine dedicated to the kshetrapala, the guardian of the temple complex, has also usually been placed at the rear left of the temple when facing it. So when you start circumambulating the temple, it's the first side and corner which you reach surrounding the temple. And they look something like this. I'm showing you here 4 examples. And it shows you also that the kshetrapala, he is not Brahmadeva, but a general protector of the compound, is usually shown with a trishula. It can also be a club. Sometimes there is only a trishula, and he can be in figural shape, or also shown as a naga. These are naga cults, but they're known as the kshetrapala, and people say that they are identical. It's a figural and a naga representation protecting the sacred temple complex. And these are examples from Hiriyangadi, the Neminatha Basadi, from the Kalu Basadi at Mudabidri, Parshvanatha temple at Venur, and the Guru Basadi at Mudabidri. But all temples in the coastal belt have at least a simple naga or a simple representation of the Kshetrapala, and in really 99% of all cases in this place. So we've often talked about compounds. We have compound walls surrounding the temples, the prakaras, and these are entered through elaborate gateway structures, the mahadvaras. And the gateways, as you can see in all these examples, also do not follow the Dravida design of gopura gateways, typical of the high plateau, but they, just like the temple structures in the region, are have sloping tiled roofs and follow the same design of wooden constructions with tiles. Interesting is that these Canara gateways are usually quite deep. We have spaces, pillared spaces at the front and also to the back, to the courtyard, where people can rest, deposit luggage, where storage rooms can be integrated, and often also separate shrine rooms to accommodate more images inside the temple complex. This is the Dera Masheti Basadi Mudabidru. You can also see how beautiful the walls are often decorated. The Shantinata temple at Venur, and this is again from Hiriyangadi, an example. As in other regions of the subcontinent, Jaina temples in Tulunadu have regularly been renovated, repaired, transformed and extended, and sometimes even entirely replaced. In substantially renovated or newly constructed structures, another change in material can be noticed. Whilst temples in the coastal belt were originally made of mud and wood, and at least partially then translated into stone, they can today also be fashioned out of concrete, or at least integrate concrete elements. Here, for instance, the Neminata Basadi at Hiriyangadi, here the pillars, the columns supporting the roof have been replaced in concrete, and you can see that also the gateway structure, although there is an old Mana stampa, has been substantially renovated. And here on the right, the Chandranata Basadi at Dharmasthala is an interesting example of an originally mud, wood and clay built temple, which was entirely pulled down completely in the 1990s. The images were transferred to a smaller temporary shrine, and it has entirely been rebuilt in the 1990s and opened early in the 2000s. It's a concrete construction clad in stone. Okay, to conclude, I'm showing you here two examples of aspects which I unfortunately couldn't integrate so much into my paper, and this is statues. They're wonderful metal and stone images throughout the region. These are 3 of the 12 statues in the Chaturmukha Basadi at Karkal, very striking display with the metal plates. And I also have not been able to say much or anything really about rituals. So I'm showing you how very elaborate these rituals, how colorful they can be in the coastal region. Particularly, this is a Mangal ritual with a kolam design in the Shantinata Basadi at Guruvayana Kere. So to conclude, as the entire lecture series of the Deccan Heritage Foundation has shown in multiple paper presentations over the past months, the Deccan region represents one of the cultural highlights of South Asia. In terms of artistic, architectural, cultural, religious, and climatic diversity, exhibiting an unbroken continuity in all these areas to the present day. The Deccan High Plateau is characterized by a hot and dry climate with little rainfall and the availability of hard stone for building projects. On the west coast, the raised lands of the Karnataka uplands descend steeply to a narrow, fertile coastal belt, drenched by regular and persistent rains with plenty of wood for building. The architecture of both regions has been adapted to the local climatic situation and the availability of construction materials. Along the west coast of Karnataka, which formed the main focus, it's most interesting in terms of climate and resource dependency, the buildings had to be adjusted to withstand a condition of prolonged and heavy rains. This paper has explored the interplay between climate and resource dependency and the freedoms which master architects and artisans working for the local Jaina community in the Deccan still found within these strongly determined circumstances. We have seen an earlier dependency on the availability of only locally available building resources, which could later be relaxed, I would argue, due to the building of roads and highways on which good quality stone could be transported over longer distances. And in the modern age, due to the creation of new construction materials such as concrete. The dependency on the climate, however, is non-negotiable. Temple structures made of whatever material were forced in the past and still have today to be adapted to the local climate, may this be a climate of extreme dryness or of heavy monsoon rains. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Hegewald. So now, if anybody would like to turn on their cameras, please do and join the conversation. While the questions start to come in, I just want to remind you that I am going to proceed in fielding the questions in a thematic order. And if there are some very detailed oriented questions, we will leave those to the end after the recording. I just want to start by saying that, you know, what came out in your lecture the most for me was this interplay between wood and stone. And I was reminded of so many examples of that, tracing back to Mahabalipuram, for instance, you know, this such an essential thing in temple architecture. And I wonder whether or not you could tell us more about the ventilation systems that these, you know, that wood and stone may have lent themselves to. Was this also about heating and creating a sort of a space that was conducive to survival or you know, surviving this intense heat?
Yes, I think in a way both are very conducive. Both create very cool, shaded and cooled environments. Wood and mud are, of course, much easier, cheaper, much easier to handle. They could be handled by people building ordinary houses. You didn't need skilled stonemasons for this. But actually, both are very, can be very easily. I mean, I guess stone temples are even more, you know, even more cool in the winter, in the summer months than the mud and wooden architecture, but even they create a very comfortable climate, I would say. And they probably, you talked about ventilation. I think they might even be slightly better ventilated because the roof, you know, there's sometimes kind of ventilation holes, or it's a more an open construction than the wooden stone roofs, which can really be very heavy and solid constructions. But yes, you're right in, you know, of course, reminding us that the change from wood to stone is something we are aware of generally in Indian temple architecture, or also in the creation of the Gavaksha niche, you know, from bent wood types to, you know, via the kind of Buddhist monastic cave temples to later constructions. I think what is so striking is that it takes place so late here in the coastal region, that the switch seems to happen, I don't know, maybe it started in the 14th century, but I would rather say in the 15th, 16th, 17th century. So interesting that wood, just like in Kerala, you know, continued to play an important role much longer than in other parts of India.
Yeah, I think that play between stone and wood is just so clear in some of the examples that you showed. And I just want to take my license as the moderator to ask you another question.
Yeah.
Is that in your previous work, you've worked so much on cosmologies and thinking about Jain cosmologies. Is there anything specific about how cosmological representation occurs in the coastal temples versus the temples that are more inland, or is it just sort of still sort of this free floating world, where these iconographies and this sort of kind of cosmological planning occurs. One might think that the coastal temples might be responding to the cosmos in a different way. So I just want to put that out there. I don't want to push for a generalization, but I am curious about this issue.
No, thank you for the question. It's a very interesting question. What is very striking in the coastal temple architecture is that the cosmological representations almost always, at least all which I have seen so far, are displayed on a first floor level. They're not on the ground floor, but always on a raised floor level. And that it's very, very often Nandishvara Dwipa, which is the eighth continent of the Jaina cosmos, which according to the text can only be reached by the gods. It's not accessible to human beings. And of course, by bringing them down to a human level and integrating them into a man-made temple, they become, levels which are not normally accessible. Heavenly levels can be made accessible. And I think this is also why they are on a first floor level, where access can be controlled much more strictly. In most cases, non-Jains are not allowed up. It's, for instance, at Guru Vayanakere, it's open. You're very welcome. Anybody can move up and examine them. In the north of India, I would say we have more cases. We have instances where cosmological items are integrated into a temple setup with images, but there we have many more examples of strictly cosmological temples, where the Nandishvara temple is the temple itself, for instance. So there are, I think, at the moment still some differences. It would be interesting to see if over time these large-scale cosmological temples are also built in the coastal region, which I am so far not aware of.
Yeah, I thank you so much for that. It's a very fascinating issue. So I'm going to ask a question by Kevin Fernandez. If Kevin would like to ask the question himself or themselves, please feel free to, but I will read it. They raised the issue of these tiles, and I'm not sure. Oh, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you very much. Really lovely to hear you discuss the temples of the district, the region I grew up in. We passed these temples on a regular basis and never knew anything about them. I was just curious about the tiles. The roof tiles are the Mangalore tiles, which were introduced by the Basel mission in the 1800s. I'm wondering, I'd really like to know if we have any access to what was used for roofing before the Basel mission tiles, before the Mangalore tiles. Was it terracotta? Was it wood? What exactly was the idea?
That's interesting. I actually wasn't aware that the tiles only came in the 18th century. That's quite extraordinary. I would assume that before, what we find sometimes on very simple local, like family temples, which are built on a very low budget, is that we have wooden tiles or straw or thatch, kind of thatch. And I assume then that this must also have been used earlier on the other temples, which of course would have again given them a slightly different appearance. So I'm really grateful to you for mentioning that. That's really an area one should look into with more detail, when tiles were first, or whether there were predecessors.
Different kind of terracotta.
Yes. And I'm not aware of that, but that's something one should really try to look into. Thank you very much for that, pointing that out. Great.
Thank you. So I'm seeing a lot of questions from from Renu Parekh and Kailash Rao and Pranati Lad, asking you to sort of contextualize these temples in comparison to other sites. So, for example, how do they compare to what we're finding in South Maharashtra, or how do they compare to what we're finding in Rajasthan or Gujarat? Just to, I'm sure there are vast differences, but if you could just speak a little bit about how these Jain temples are different from other ones in neighboring or even distant regions.
In a way, there are actually a lot of similarities, and I maybe start with those. The arrangement of space, of having a shrine and multiple halls leading up to them in an axial fashion is something which is shared throughout India. Also, Jaina temples generally often are multi-shrined and multi-storied. So this is something which is actually a general feature which is not distinct to the region of Karnataka, although it's interesting that in the coastal belt we have maybe particularly many examples of these double and triple storied temples, which I think might actually be due to the light building fabric in wood and mud, which allowed that more easily also. No? But this continued and very pronounced use of wood and tiles and mud, or then concrete later to replace it, is something which doesn't continue so long in other regions. As we said, you know, it's so striking that into the 15th, 16th century, we still have wood used so prominently in Kerala and Karnataka, because it's such a readily available and reasonable building material. Now in, let's say in Gujarat, well, actually in Gujarat, we also have remains of, and in Maharashtra, there are wooden temples. Yes, I know now what they mean. Okay, I understand. But they are more closely in the ones I have seen, let's say in the old part of Ahmedabad or in Nasik, Ujjain, maybe. In my view, the ones I've seen, they are more closely related to domestic architecture, to residential structures. They blend more into the city environment. They often are merchant communities who built wooden temples close to in the quarters of their towns where the Jain families live together, to have places of worship close to their residences. And they differ, I would say, from larger pilgrimage sites outside the towns, Ossian or Ranakpur, which, you know, are wonderful stone-built constructions, and where stone added importance and significance to the temples, because it was very expensive and time-consuming to build them, and demanded a lot of donations, which is slightly different from. But it's interesting that in the coastal region of Karnataka, the wooden temples or wood was also employed in really major temple constructions and major temple buildings, such as the Chandranatha or Hosa Basadi at Mudabidri, for instance, which is the largest temple in town. And it is also, it's a combination of stone and wood, but involving wood where it's not 100% stone, as we would typically find at larger sites in central or northern India.
Okay, so there's a question from Karthik Mully. Karthik, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hello, hi.
Hello.
Yes, hi.
Dr. Hegewald, I'd like to ask you a question about the inscriptions of the temples.
Mm-hmm.
As I understand, like in the course of my own work, I had come across some of the inscriptions used at these Jain temples, and I was struck by a difference in traditions. Like a lot of the inscriptions at Hindu temples came from kings or from, you know, like nobles, whereas with the Jain temples, I think a lot of them were more from like priests or merchants. And I was just wondering if there's a difference like in like information that we can glean from these inscriptions, since they come from people closer to the average, you know.
Yes, I would agree with you. Yeah, yeah. They're very, very interesting. Oh, I'm so sorry. I hope this will... I'm so sorry. I don't know how to stop this. I can't switch off this phone. I'm really sorry. I hope it will not...
It's okay if it's important.
Hello? Okay, we'll leave it. I'm so sorry.
No
The Jain inscriptions are indeed very fascinating, and they show us that in addition to... Hegewald? Ich halte gerade einen Vortrag. Bitte ruf nicht wieder an, ja? Ich melde mich später. Tschüss. Super, danke. Jetzt ist es beendet. I'm so sorry.
No worries at all. Don't worry about it at all.
I can switch off my mobile, but the landline is broken. I'm so sorry. Yes, so kings and queens, we know, are mentioned in these inscriptions, but you're quite right, Kartik, that we have a lot of references to priests, to monks, to nuns, to lay people, and also particularly many to female patrons who donated either money for temple constructions or land for the upkeep, or even smaller donations which are recorded and give us the impression that temple building and temple or maintenance of temples was not an exclusively royal or matter of rulers, but that in a way maybe not the lowest, but at least many levels of Jain community or of the community could be involved. And this, I think, also, I mean, added or acted as role models. You know, this idea that dana it's important in Hinduism, in Buddhism, of course, but also in Jainism. We have a very evolved culture of giving and of earning merit, not just for you, but for the wider family. This religious bidding, which we see, for instance, around the Mahamastak Abhisheka, of being allowed to pour the first kalasha, the first pot, or subsequent kalashas, is something which is very ingrained, I think, in Jain ritual life, and allows the laity to participate very strongly in aesthetic acts of giving, of giving up, which is so important, of course, on the level of the aesthetics, but allows also lay people, at least temporarily, to interact very much on this level. And this is very beautifully reflected, I would say, in the inscriptions, showing us that this is not a modern phenomenon, but this is really about the core of Jain practice then and now. Yeah.
So the last recorded question, I just want to remind everybody that we'll have time for other questions after, but the last question that we will take is from Professor Giles Tillotson, who asks, would it be correct to conclude that for Jains in this region, the desire to assert identity through visual means was less determining factor than climate? Giles, if you want to turn your screen on and clarify, please do, but that's what he's written.
Can you I don't think we'll turn the screen on, but because the host stopped it. But can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So obviously what I have in mind here, that there are plenty of cases of architectural traditions within South Asia where the need to assert a particular identity, be it political or religious or cultural or whatever, actually supersedes issues of climate and materials and even technology. I mean, there are kind of absurdities where the things against the technological reasonableness, as it were, in order to achieve something else. And this seemed to feature much less than more practical issues in your presentation, and therefore I wonder where you would rate it, or do you think that the kinds of concerns about identity are so much tied with imperial power, and because of the status of the Jains in these, particularly in the coastal regions, that those issues did not come into play?
Yes, very interesting. Thank you very much. I actually, yes, one thinks of, let's say, the temples in Himachal Pradesh, a region which is also very prone to rain, where traditionally the temples would also be more in a pagoda style. But then, of course, we have shikara temples, which didn't work. So roofs had to be attached to them. Yes, great idea. I'm not aware of a single Jain temple in the coastal, and I'm saying I'm not aware, I'm not saying that there isn't one, but I've not ever seen a Shikara Jain temple in the coastal belt, which had to be kind of protected because it didn't quite work. I wonder, actually, I have almost the feeling that it has to do with identity, but the other way around, which you seem to indicate. I feel that there is a very strong local feeling. I mean, the people are very proud of being in coastal Karnataka, and they feel different about being in this region than the High Deccan Plateau. And there is a certain pride, I think, that one is different. And I have the feeling that maybe even this local identity was kind of reaffirmed by saying, okay, we use your materials, but we do it our way, not through a dependency and having to do it like this, but possibly wanting to do it like this to look different. I mean, they are very impressive, these temples, aren't they? They look very striking. I find often when people who have not seen them before that they are absolutely flabbergasted that something like this could be in India. You know, they think of Nepal or of China or whatever. But it is a field I would like to think, or a question I would like to think more about. But I have the feeling there is a very strong local identity also. The way Hinduism and Jainism are practiced is different in many ways, because they both involve very strong Buddha worship, local worship of local spirits, which are not really done or not considered mainstream Jainism in other regions. And maybe today, sometimes people don't like to speak so much about it, or they like to, you know, brush it a little bit aside, and they don't want to be different. But I think traditionally one probably felt quite strongly about one's regional identity. But it would be interesting to research more why, you know, why, if it is the case, what I'm saying, what favored this? I mean, why? Why this was so persistent.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting reply.
Thanks.
Thank you, Giles. Nice to see you. And Helen or Abhishek, if either of you have questions at this time, please chime in. Otherwise, Helen will close the session.
Does Abhishek have a question? No, I know we lost it.
Okay.
I think there's many questions, but I don't think there is the time, because I think Julia has raised a number of issues which I find fascinating, both building techniques, building forms, how they interpret everybody as every region's identity. These are issues that deserve a lecture by themselves.
Yes.
So, but thank you for raising all these questions. It was fascinating. I really enjoyed the lecture.